Okay. Hi, my name is Stephen Paul. I'm an intern with the SAM team at NREL in the GEM Fellowship Program, which provides funding and professional development opportunities like this internship for underrepresented students pursuing a graduate degree. NREL is a GEM employer member, and they selected me as a fellow, so I had the privilege to work with the SAM team this summer, and I'll be hosting this first webinar in the 2021 series. This session will be focused on the merchant plant financial model features added to SAM. Oh, sorry. The rest of the 2021 webinar series will follow the schedule, and each session, including this one, will be recorded and available on the SAM website, which is linked at the bottom of the slide. You can find more information and register for the webinars on the events page linked here. All of the topics covered in this webinar series are being shown as part of the development version of SAM, so you may not be able to see the presented features in the version of SAM you've been working with. But an official 2021 release is planned for this fall. If you have questions during the presentation, feel free to type them in the questions box on the right panel of your GoToWebinar software. Other members of the SAM team are present in this webinar and will either type a response to your question or it will be held and then answered at the end of the presentation. As a little bit of an overview of this webinar, I will be briefly reviewing what SAM is, what merchant plants are, how NREL's Cambium data viewer ties into the financial model. Then I'll walk through the merchant plant features, and we'll go over the simulation results and use the remaining time for questions, for answering questions. So what is SAM? At its core, SAM is a free open source software developed and distributed by NREL, used to analyze power plants and related systems. It provides technical models supporting a variety of renewable generation technology, including solar, wind, geothermal, marine energy, and more, and then can calculate the system's cash flow based on SAM's financial models. SAM's current financial models include residential and commercial models for when generation is happening behind the meter or at the load to reduce electricity bills for the customer, power purchase agreement or PPA model, which is essentially a payment contract ensuring predictable or fixed cash flow, and is also the most common financial model for power plants. And then the third-party ownership model, where the site host and plant developer have their own agreement for compensation. So then the merchant plant model is, it has some new features and will be covered for the first time officially in this webinar. And the community solar model is a new financial model, which will be covered later in this webinar series. For more information about SAM itself, or if you'd like to participate in the forum, you can visit the SAM website at sam.nrel.gov and /forum if you would like to access the forum. What defines a merchant plant and when do I use this feature in SAM? A merchant plant's main difference from other power plants is that there's no power purchase agreement. Merchant plants are not locked into a fixed rate that the plant charges for electricity, but at the same time, they do not have that security of a long-term contract. The absence of a long-term contract is also one of the defining factors in determining when to use SAM's merchant plant model, as this financial model is specifically designed for operating with more flexible pricing than what is offered in a contract. Merchant plants will participate in the day-ahead spot market to generate revenue as shown on the right in a diagram from the Regional Transmission Operator or Organization, PJM. Here, cleared prices can fluctuate due to other bidding suppliers and hourly demand. So while merchant plants have flexibility, it can be hard to predict revenue and riskier to make profit. The main feature that gives flexibility to the merchant plant financial model in SAM is the ability to enter a matrix of power in the corresponding hourly price data to allow some forecasting of revenue for a project. To make that process easier, we look to NREL's Cambium data viewer. The Cambium data viewer is a collection created from reads, dgen, plexos, and Cambium models for the purpose of providing API access and visualizing the model data as shown on the right in a screenshot of the data viewer itself. While the Cambium API contains a wide variety of metrics, as you can see on the left panel of the data viewer, we isolated its hourly marginal cost metrics, which are shown in red, which contain data categorized into read standard cost scenarios like high renewables or low battery cost, the location within the United States, and the forecasted year. Then we implemented the API in SAM's merchant plane model to easily copy the marginal cost data into a project. The Cambium dataset is intended to reflect the least cost operation of the electricity system, and therefore may not be the best representation of realistic price data. However, it can be a reasonable proxy for locational marginal pricing in some locations, and therefore has been included in SAM to help users without that more accurate data estimate the value of a merchant plant system. The limitations of the Cambium dataset are more thoroughly described in section 2 of their Cambium documentation, which is available at the link at the bottom of the slide, cambium.nrel.gov. We'll now switch over to SAM to go through the merchant plant changes. Before I begin the walkthrough, it should be reiterated here that what is currently being shown is the development version of SAM. So not everything that will be shown is final or guaranteed to look the same when the 2021 fall release is made available. We're starting from SAM's welcome page, where you can create or open a project or an LK script. LK is the programming language that this graphical user interface was built in, so you can experiment or streamline your own processes from here. From this page, there's also a quick start guide for new users and a more general help button that will be referenced throughout this webinar. Additionally, this help button is context sensitive, so clicking it on this welcome screen opens a page related to the welcome screen, and it's the same way throughout the rest of SAM. For starting a new project, you'll first select your desired performance model. So we're going to go with the detailed PV model. And if the merchant plant financial model is available for the selected performance model, simply double-clicking or selecting and hitting OK will create the project for you. The project will open into one of the technical tabs, which can be viewed and navigated on the left side of the window. I'll be primarily focusing on the revenue tab, as that is where the bulk of the changes in the application of the merchant plant occur. If you'd like more information about the other technical and financial aspects of the performance models, there are multiple webinars covering them in detail available on the SAM website, which is again sam.nrel.gov. Complementary to the webinars, you can also access the help pages in SAM for the tab that is selected, like location and resource, by clicking the help button in the top right corner of each page, which will give more information about what is shown on the page you're on. You'll notice throughout the project that there are several fields that are already filled with values. These are roughly estimated default values to make it easier to get a new project up and running without having to go through every single input and fill it out. To briefly summarize the technical tabs in this detailed PV performance model, they will essentially walk you through replicating or designing your system, starting with inputs such as location-specific weather files that can be imported from the NSRDB, and moving on through the PV module type, inverters, system capacity, shading, other losses, curtailment, and degradation. And then the financial tabs help with estimating the value of the system that you've just created, starting with the upfront costs, the recurring costs, general financing parameters, revenue streams, federal and state incentives, and depreciation. Before we jump into the revenue page, there is one relevant input I'd like to highlight on the financial parameters page. This analysis period input directly influences the amount of data that's required on the following revenue page, as it dictates the duration that contributes to the power plant's value. Then continuing on to the revenue page, the revenue tab is where the merchant plant differs from other financial models. And if you have built an older version of SIM with the merchant plant model, you'll notice there have been quite a few changes here. Starting from the top, there are 5 different tabs. These represent different possible revenue streams. The energy market revenue is enabled by default, as you can see here, and represents the primary revenue of the power system, whereas the other 4 tabs are ancillary services that SAM will assume the system is able to provide, but they're disabled by default. Each of the tabs have identical layouts for revenue entry, consisting of an enable box, radio selection that tells you what the revenue input type is, and then there are the revenue inputs. These revenue inputs are referred to as lifetime matrices, and I'll continue to do so through the rest of the webinar. Around the revenue tab and the lifetime matrices, you'll see that these terms cleared capacity and price are used often. Cleared capacity is essentially the amount of power in megawatts that is cleared for sale via the merchant contract, up to but not exceeding the amount of power that the system can generate. And the price is the rate that is paid for that cleared capacity to generate revenue. Clicking on the Edit Lifetime Data button that is shown as enabled will open up a pop-up window with a table filled with default values. As you can see, there'll be a locked analysis period for reference, which comes from that input that I referenced on the financial parameters page. There'll be a mode selection that controls the time steps of the time series data for the duration of the analysis period, and several buttons for manipulating the data within the table. As we defined before, the cleared capacity column is an entry for hourly generation in megawatts that contributes to this revenue stream, and the price column is the hourly marginal price that gets applied to that corresponding hour of cleared capacity in the revenue calculation. For estimating system value, the appropriate price data could be imported from a market operator's historical locational marginal pricing records, depending on the location of the project, and cleared capacity values would be known from the terms of the power sale. The data can be entered into this matrix from either importing a TXT or CSV file using the import button here, or from your clipboard using the paste button here. However, this paste button is limited to pasting both columns at once. If you'd like to paste single columns or ranges of cells, you can select and operate the table similar to an Excel document, and you can select the entire column by clicking on the column header. Then you can use the shortcut Control-V to paste your data. Lastly, there are some new alternative methods back on the revenue page for entering data into the matrix. As there are 8,760 hours per year and 25 years in this analysis period, it can be troublesome filling in all that data efficiently. So we added a few options to facilitate that process. The first of which is to select the other radio option that reads % of hourly generation and price. So what that does, it will disable one of the matrix buttons, but will enable the set of inputs below it. This option allows you to assign a percentage. So we're just going to go ahead and type in 100% there, instead of manually entering the cleared capacity column. So because of that, this newly enabled matrix only contains a price column, as you can see here, which must be filled. To fill the price column more efficiently, in the absence of historical market data, we implemented the Cambium API mentioned earlier in this webinar. There are multiple inputs for customizing the data to request from the API. So you can specify the location type, which contains states, balancing areas, and the contiguous United States is the only nation available in Cambium. The location, which currently shows all of the states in the contiguous United States. Then there's the forecasted year, which currently is limited to even years between 2020 and 2050. And if one of the single years is selected, that year of Cambium data will be duplicated to fill the analysis period. So currently our matrix would fill with 25 repeated data years of 2050. There is an additional multiple year option at the bottom of the input that, if selected, adds the option to increment over the analysis period from the specified start year. The available start years are calculated based on the analysis period and Cambium's forecast limit of 2050. In this incrementing selection, the discrepancy of having only even years is handled in SAM by duplicating the even years to cover the missing odd years. So as each year is retrieved from Cambium, it's duplicated in SAM if necessary to cover the missing odd years, as you can see in this table. And while this may detract from its accuracy, it should be reiterated that the inclusion of the Cambium dataset is just to provide a reasonable proxy for when the user lacks more accurate data. Due to making an API call for each year in this multiple years option, it's much slower to make that API call than a single year. For example, for this simulation, it would take about 20 seconds to copy 25 years from Cambium into the price data. So we're going to switch that back to 2050 and run a download. The final cost, or the final API input costs are, final API inputs are the cost metric and cost scenario. Which are both accompanied by tooltips. If you click the tooltip, it will give a description of the metric or scenario to provide more transparency. So when you click the download API, the download button, the API call will be made to Cambium, to the Cambium data viewer, and the data will be copied into the price column of only the active lifetime matrix. You cannot copy to disabled matrices nor to inactive tabs. And you can see that filled up the price column. The capacity payment block is independent of the rev. Yes.
Sorry to interrupt. There's just a relevant question here, which is, does Cambium include February 29th in leap years?
I am not entirely certain, but both the years that Cambium draws its weather data and the year that all of the Cambium data was generated were both leap years. So I would assume it does. But I can also check on that. Yeah, sure.
I'll jump in here that the read runs used to generate the Cambium data typically limit to an 8760. And I believe what they've historically done is that they include February 29th, but they exclude December 31st, which does make the data a little bit tricky if you're looking at a data set that does not reflect that same paradigm. However, because they're using concurrent weather data and load data, it probably still creates reasonable daily fluctuations that are fairly well tied to the seasons.
Okay, thank you for the question. So the capacity payment block is independent of the revenue tabs and is only present on this default tab, as you can see. Capacity payments are essentially annual payments to a power plant for its available capacity, and these payments could be dependent on the system nameplate values or a fixed payment per year, which can be toggled with the radio input here. Since we have filled out some of the revenue information, we can go ahead and run a simulation. Just checking that it's at 100%. And once the simulation finishes, you'll start on the summary page of results. There are several useful outputs for visualizing the effect of the financial model here. First, there is the metric summary, which contains several useful metrics like levelized cost of energy, LCOE, net present value, NPV, or the internal rate of return, IRR. More information about these metrics is provided in previous webinars available on the SAM website at sam.nrel.gov. So for this webinar, I'll be focusing on the effect of the NPV, which represents the financial feasibility of the power plant. Here you can see our NPV is actually negative, and what this says about the system is that a merchant plant financial approach is not favorable with this default configuration. Another useful chart is the NPV of revenue components, which shows the contribution from different revenue streams. So as you can see, we filled out the energy market revenue inputs, and we only have revenue from that stream. This chart can also help identify areas of the project that can be modified to improve the NPV, some of which we'll take a look at shortly. Finally, the project after-tax cash flow chart is helpful for identifying how much revenue is generated or losses are incurred during specific years of the analysis period. If we jump over to the cash flow tab, we can see some more precise numbers for the generated revenue, as well as how it measures up against expenses and all other financial variables of the project. But one of the most important tabs for the merchant plant financial model is the time series tab. This tab provides visualization for some of the inputs that we specified in the project, as well as the hourly resulting revenue. What is shown by default is in blue is the calculated system generation. But if we look on the right under lifetime hourly data, we can search for some of the inputs and outputs that we want to see. So looking at the top here, you can see there's all of the ancillary services. We didn't fill out any of the inputs there, so all of these would be 0. But if you scroll further down, you can find the energy market revenue variables that we did fill out. So if we enable the energy market cleared capacity, we set the percentage to 100 to copy a 1-to-1 scale of the system generation. So you can see that matches up perfectly. And we entered in price data from Cambium. So you can see that graphed here. And when that price is applied to the cleared capacity, you get the revenue. And you can see how that time series is enabled here. So then jumping back to the NPV, we're going to experiment with a couple of inputs to see if we can make the project a little bit more feasible. So I'm actually going to start back on the revenue tab. Let's go with prices from New York, just to show that the price data that's entered here does make a difference in the NPV. Running that simulation, you'll see that the NPV drops by approximately 10 million. So that this would be a different location. And then back on the revenue tab where I mentioned the capacity payment type, if we enter in an experimental value for that, so $100 per megawatt, and then an ideal scenario where we can get 100% of the eligible nameplate capacity for our credit, and 1% escalation. Running that simulation again, we'll raise the NPV by about $50,000, which is comparatively small to the current value of the NPV, but we can look to other fields to try and change that. So then if we look at the project debt, and for our project, if we knew that we only needed to acquire enough debt to cover 60% of the total installation costs, We could then set that here instead of having SAM automatically size the debt with this debt service coverage ratio. And if we simulate that again, we can see that the NPV actually rose by about 8 million. So since the NPV for this merchant plan is still negative, the takeaway is that SAM and this financial model can be used to evaluate and experiment with different configurations to design a power plant that is profitable while meeting the requirements of the user. And that is about it. Thank you. And I guess we have a lot of time for questions.
Thank you, Stephen. If you have a question, feel free to type it in the question box, or you could also raise your hand and we can unmute your line if you'd like to follow up with a question about Sam's merchant plant or the Cambium data set. While we're waiting for people to formulate their questions, we are planning to release a new version of SAM later this fall. We don't have a definite date yet. We're working on several new features, among them this new Cambium download feature. But keep an eye out for that new version of SAM later this calendar year. So there is a question here from Jason. Can SAM do a mixed merchant PPA project? For example, a 200 megawatt plant with 150 megawatts under PPA and 50 megawatts under merchant plant. Do you want to take that, Stephen, or should I take a stab at it?
I could, how about I could take a shot at it and you can correct me if I'm wrong.
That's good.
Because from my interpretation from past meetings, you should be able to start up multiple financial models and then combine them with a macro. So that is what I'm thinking the approach there would be to start up one system with the specific amount of generation that's going towards the merchant plant price scenario, and then start up another case that is covered by the PPA, and then you can merge those two cases with the combined cases macro at the bottom left panel.
Yeah, that's where I was my mind was going with this too. So the combined cases macro is actually works when you have two different performance models and you want to combine the output of the performance models. So I have two different generation profiles and add those generation profiles together and have that be the input for a financial model. But this case is a little different where we want to run two different financial models. And SAM isn't really designed to do that. I think the way you would have to do that is model them as two separate projects, a 200 megawatt project with the single owner, PPA single owner financial model, and then a 50 megawatt project for the with the merchant financial model. Just off of the top of my head, I think that would be the approach you need to use. I don't know if anyone else on the team has a thought on that.
Yeah, this is Janine Keefe. I'll jump in. Thanks, Jason, for the question, and I may be following up with you afterwards. But this is the first we've heard, I think, about combining different types of financial models for a single plant. So that's something we'll definitely want to start looking into the possibilities for doing in SAM. We'd had our eye on possible improvements for something that's a little bit more of a hybrid approach rather than, I would call this more of a split approach, where you're under a power purchase agreement for certain times during the year and the rest of the time you operate as a merchant plant. That had been something on our wish list to be able to add, although we have not been able to fund it yet. But it sounds like we should add this type of thing to that same wish list, where you can operate different parts of the plant differently as far as the finances are concerned, but share the cost benefits of having it be one single plant. So we will probably follow up with you for a little more information on that.
Any other questions or comments? We can wait a few more minutes. Otherwise, we'll go ahead and sign off. And again, as Stephen mentioned, we'll be posting a recording of this webinar on the SAM website. It may take a few days for us to do that. You can look on the events page where you registered for this webinar. We'll post all the recordings, links to recordings of the most recent webinars on that events page. And then eventually, we also post the webinar recordings on the various topic pages. So there's a merchant plant page on the SAM website that will have a link to this webinar recording. So you'll be able to find it either on the events page in the next few months or on the merchant plant page.
I'll also advertise that Stephen is also working on a case study report or journal article with a little bit more detailed examples of running the merchant plant model that we're hoping to publish in the next couple of months here. So be sure to keep an eye out for that if you're interested in slightly more detailed examples of applications of this model with systems that are meant to represent some realistic systems in the US. That, when it is published, will also be linked from the SAM website.
Okay, well, if there aren't any further questions, thanks everyone for participating today, and thank you, Stephen, for this very informative webinar. And we look forward to being in touch with you all, either via the SAM forum or another one of these webinars. So with that, I think we'll sign off. Thanks, everyone. Goodbye, and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.